Welcome, creative adventurers. I'm Debbie Cohn with D. Cohn Designs. Thank you for stopping by today. This is week 1 of the Ukraine Always Quilt Along. If you missed the overview video a couple of days ago, please go to my YouTube channel and find the video. Just posted a couple of days ago, and then go to my blog at dcohndesigns.com to the free pattern section. There you'll find a PDF of the download for the overview. That will give you the fabric requirements and the schedule and an overview of the quilt. In today's video, we'll be sewing block 1, the Ukrainian flag, which you can see behind me. It won't take very long to sew up this particular block. So I've also included part of block 2, which is the cutting instructions. I'll show you how to cut all the pieces you need for the block 2 of the Ukraine Always quilt. A quick recap: this quilt along is 3 weeks. This week is the first week. Next week we'll cover block 2, and the third week will be the finishing, setting, and reveal. I hope you'll join me for the next 3 weeks of this quilt along. I hope you'll consider donating $12, which would normally be the cost of a free pattern, to the charity of your choice that is assisting Ukraine and Ukrainian refugees during this terrible crisis with the invasion of Russia in Ukraine. My quilt, at this point, I intend to auction off on eBay, with 100% of the proceeds going to a charity supporting Ukraine and Ukrainian refugees. In addition, after the conclusion of this quilt along, I will consolidate all 3 weeks of the pattern into one pattern and then offer that for sale along with additional sizes. The pattern that you are able to download for free from my website is a lap size, 60 by 60. At the conclusion of this quilt along weeks, I will consolidate the instructions for these 3 weeks and then add more sizes. So the complete pattern will include 2 sizes of wall hangings, a baby quilt, the lap size, which is this one, the twin, the queen, and the king size, all available for purchase in one pattern on my website, in my shop. That will be available after the conclusion of this quilt along. I hope you'll consider purchasing the pattern if you would like to use it for additional sizes in the future. Please stay tuned to the end of this video, where I show you another quilt project that I've been working on that I mentioned in a couple of videos ago, called Quilters Stand for Ukraine, and I've made one of those quilts. In addition to cutting and sewing block 1, we will also be cutting all the pieces for block 2. This is a sample of block 2, and in this video I will show you how to cut all the pieces you need quickly and easily. Make sure to watch the entire video. You can find the cut list for both blocks and the cutting instructions for block 1 in this week's PDF on my blog at dcohndesigns.com. The title of the pattern section to download will be Ukraine Always Quilt Along week number 1. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up, leave me a comment and let me know that you're participating. Subscribe to my YouTube channel and click that notifications bell. Then head on over to my blog at dcohndesigns.com, and there you'll find in the free pattern section the PDF for today's instructions along with the overview from the previous week. There's also another free table runner pattern for your inspiration and quilting. I'd like to talk a little bit about fabric preparation and tools that you'll need for this short quilt along. First, for both of blocks 1 and 2, you will need these tools. What will be helpful is either a pair of scissors or a pair of snips. Of course, your rotary cutter, your cutting mat, and a long ruler will help. Then with your fabric, I'd like to suggest, if you're able to, if you choose to purchase yardage from a fabric store or have yardage in your stash, it would be helpful if you were able to get it cut down into half-yard increments. That would make it much easier to handle. Or if you're using fat quarters, that works perfectly as well. Again, from the overview, you'll need 2 3/4 yards, approximately 11 fat quarters worth of blue fabric, and the same 2 3/4 yards or 11 fat quarters of yellow fabric. It could be solid or prints. You can see here with mine that I've chosen some low volume prints. This is block 1, the Ukrainian flag, which we will be sewing today. For block 2, the rolling stone block, I recommend these additional optional but helpful tools. If you have a smaller ruler like this or like this, both would be helpful, although this one you don't actually have to have. In addition, This is a 4.5-inch square ruler, and it would be very helpful if you have it for trimming up your blocks. If you don't, that's fine. I will show how to do both with and without it in block 2 when we're squaring up our units for the rolling stone block. The last tool that is optional but nice to have would be a design board of some sort. Here you can see my homemade one, very super inexpensive. It's just a piece of foam board covered with a spare scrap of batting, and I put some duct tape around it to hold it down. You can also purchase fancy, nice ones. You can certainly make your own. That just makes it easier so that you have your block. In this case, this one has a lot of pieces to it. You can have your block on your design board. You can carry it around, it won't fall off, and you can refer to it quickly and easily when assembling your blocks. The last thing that you might find helpful, if you have it, is a rotating cutting mat for block 2. That will make trimming the blocks go faster and easier, but it again is not necessary. Let's move on to preparing and cutting our fabric for block 1. So here I have on my cutting mat the blue fabric for block 1. I recommend that you iron your fat quarters or your yardage. That way you'll have the most accurate cuts. The next thing, of course, you'll want to do is to cut off your selvages. The next thing you'll want to do is to cut the selvages off of your yardage or your fat quarters. You can see mine here lined up on my mat, and then I'm going to slice it and cut off the selvage. All right, for block number 1, we need a 6.5 by 12.5 inch rectangle in the blue and a 6.5 by 12.5 inch rectangle in the yellow. You can see here that I have my half-yard fabric section laid out on my cutting mat. I've cut the selvages off, and now I'm going to begin cutting the 6.5 by 12.5 inch pieces. I recommend, for efficient usage of your fabric, to cut the 6.5 this way and the 12.5 going this way. That way you can get the maximum number that you need out of one section of fabric, 1 fat quarter or 1/2 yard. I have this half-yard piece folded over, so I'm going to go ahead and cut 2 6.5 by 12.5 pieces, and then I'll cut them going the other direction so that they're actually 6.5 by 12.5. You'll notice that I have my longer ruler and that I've got a weight on the other end. That way my ruler won't slip. So let's cut the pieces. Now we're going to cut it the other way. I've lined up the section on my cutting mat, and I'm just making sure that both parts meet the line or beyond the line so I can trim it off to ensure an even cut. Now that I've trimmed off the edge, I'm going to count over 12.5 inches and finish the last cut for the block. And there you have it, 2 6.5 by 12.5 inch rectangles. Then you'll repeat the same thing to get the other 3 rectangles you'll need in blue, and then repeat that again for your yellow fabric, so you have a total of 5 rectangles in yellow and 5 rectangles in blue. Both sets are 6.5 by 12.5. Again, here is block 1. It's the Ukrainian flag, blue on the top, yellow on the bottom. So all we'll need to do is take 1 blue rectangle, 1 yellow rectangle, right sides together, and we're going to stitch with a 1/4 inch seam all the way down. Let's take it to the machine. You can see that I've lined up my fabric rectangles. I'm using diagonal seam tape that has a 1/4 inch line on it. You could use a 1/4 inch foot or a sewing ledge made of masking tape, whatever works for you to get an accurate 1/4 inch seam. Let's go ahead and sew. There we go. Now we're going to press the seam toward the dark side. So that means I'm going to press when I press, set my seam, and then press going toward the blue. I take the nose of my iron and I gently press the seam toward the dark side, in this case the blue. Give it a quick shot of steam, and it's all set. There you have 1 Ukrainian flag block. You can chain piece or assembly line style make the rest of them. Then you want to trim the block to 12.5 by 12.5. You can either do that when you finish these blocks or wait and square all of your blocks for the entire quilt at the same time. It's up to you. And here they are, the 5 Ukrainian flag blocks we'll need for the Ukraine Always quilt. Next, I'm going to show you how to cut the fabric for block 2. Before we get into the details, let me go over the anatomy of block 2, which is the rolling stone block. This block is a traditional quilt block called the rolling stone block. Let me show you how it's put together. In the center you have a 4.5-inch square, and then the corners are also 4.5-inch squares, but they have stitch and flip corners on them. I'll show you how to do it. It's quick and easy. These sections here are 4.5 by 4.5, and you have one 2-color rectangle here. It's 4.5 by 4.5. Another 2-color rectangle here, here, and here. 4.5 by 4.5 2-color rectangles. Again, you've got your 4.5 by 4.5-inch square in the center, and then you have your 4.5-inch stitch and flip blocks on the corners. What we're going to do is start with our biggest pieces first. In this case, it will be making the strip sets for the 4.5 by 4.5 double color rectangles. In order to making this block quick and easy, we're going to use strip sets. Instead of cutting the rectangles individually and sewing them together, we're going to make long strip sets of the colors and then cut the strip set down into the correct sizes. So let's start with cutting the strips we'll need to make our strip sets. To make the strip sets for the double color rectangles, you'll need 2 fat quarters of blue and 2 fat quarters of yellow. Or you can do what I did, and I did half yards, so you need a half a yard of blue, half a yard of yellow. The first thing you'll want to do, of course, is to trim off your selvages. I've shown how to do that earlier in the video, so I'm not going to do it again. The next thing you'll want to do after you trim the selvages off your fat quarters or half yards is to trim the other side. So straighten up your fabric and cut a straight edge along this side. Then we're going to cut in 2.5-inch strips going this direction. The reason for that is each of these rectangles here are 4.5 inches this way and 2.5 inches this way. When we sew them both together, they'll be 4.5 by 4.5. But instead of cutting them individually, we're going to make long strip sets. So you need 4.5, 4.5, 4.5, and 4.5. That equals 18 inches. But rather than trust that your fat quarters are exactly 18 inches or longer, we're going to cut it long ways so we have a little bit of margin for error. You will need 1 strip set per block for a total of 20 strips of blue and 20 strips of yellow. Each block will require 1 18-inch strip of yellow and 1 18-inch strip of blue in order to make these rectangles. For these rectangles, you will need 4 fat quarters of blue and 4 fat quarters of yellow, or 1 yard each of the blue and yellow. What I've done is I've taken 2 half-yard pieces, a half yard of blue and a half yard of yellow, and stacked them together. I'm not doing full yards or the full fat quarters, so to speak, because I don't trust my rotary cutter to slice evenly through it, and it's very unwieldy. You can, of course, stack fat quarters if you'd like to and your yardage, but I'm just going to do it this way. It'll just take a little bit longer, but not much. Each fat quarter will equal 5 strips, which is enough for 5 blocks. I've trimmed the selvages off of my half yards, and I've turned the fabric so that the length is going this way. So this would be the 21.5 inch, or this would be the 21-inch length, and then going across this way would be the 18-inch width. I've laid my ruler down, I've put a weight on it to keep it from slipping. I measure over 2.5 inches, and then I'm going to cut. There we go. I've got 2 long strips. I'm going to cut up the rest of these, and then we'll have our strips all ready for our double color rectangles and move on to cutting the pieces for the rest of the block. Once you've cut your 2.5-inch strips, you'll want to lay them on your mat and then trim the very edges. So you don't want the fold here, you want the edges here. And we're going to trim them down to 18 inches. If you prefer, and you're sewing yardage, you could leave your strips with the fabric. However, I'm cutting it down to 18-inch strips. One, because that's how I know I need one strip per block, and two, I don't want a bow in the middle of my strips. So to help prevent that, I'm going to cut mine down to 18-inch strips. Then I'm going to measure over 18 inches and cut. Here I've stacked my strips. I've cut one end, measuring over 18 inches, making sure my strips are lined up again this way and along the edge. Put my ruler down, use my weight, and now I'm going to cut at 18 inches. If you need to err, just err on the long side, maybe 1/8 of an inch, just to make sure, in case you have minor cutting errors. You can see you have these strips that are leftovers. When you open them out, there's a fair amount there. You've got 6.5 inches. Go ahead and save those, because you can cut those down into the 2.5 by 2.5 inch squares that we'll need later in the block, especially for your blue ones. You will definitely need that. Here you can see we have our 2.5 inch by 18 inch strips. The yellow is labeled C and the blue is labeled F. Now we're moving on to cutting our 4.5 by 4.5 inch squares. You will need 6 fat quarters plus an additional 9 inches that you can use from the leftover yellow fabric from the flag block in block number 1. Each fat quarter will result in 16 4.5 by 4.5 inch squares. Before you start cutting, however, you need to double check to make sure your fabric is the correct width. It has to be at least 18 inches. And here I have half yard cuts, and mine is just over. It's about almost 1/4 of an inch over, so I'm good. Check your fat quarters too. They really do need to be at least 18 inches wide. If they're not, you'll have to use the additional yellow fabric yardage. I did allow a little bit extra in the fabric requirements so that you can cut additional squares if you need to. Even if it's not 18 inches, you'll be able to get the first 3 rows. It'll just be the last 4 that you won't be able to cut. You should be able to get 16 4.5 by 4.5 inch squares out of every 18 by 21 inch piece of fabric. In my case, I'm using half yard cuts, so I'm going to do it faster, and I'm going to stack another half yard cut on top of it. That will make my cutting go more quickly. I'm comfortable with 4 layers of fabric, but you do whatever amount of layers that you are comfortable with. Let's get cutting. I've double checked that my fabric is at least 18 inches wide. I've laid it down. I've laid my ruler and my weight on at 4.5 inches, and I'm going to cut. There we go. And I'll continue cutting the rest of the fabric, and then I'll turn the strips around and cut the other direction. I've laid my 4.5 inch strips out on my mat. I'm just double checking one more time when I line them up that they are straight along the lines of my mat, and I'm going to trim the very edge just to make sure it's exactly straight. Next, I'm going to measure over 4.5 inches and cut the strips. And I continue cutting the rest of the strips. You will need a total of 100 4.5 by 4.5 inch yellow fabric squares. And that's all we'll need to cut out of the yellow fabric. Here you can see I have my stacks of 4.5 by 4.5 inch squares. I recommend that you put them in stacks of 4, and so you'll have a total of 80 squares, 4 per block for 20 blocks. The rest of the blocks, there'll be 20 left. Those are for the center of the block. Label them fabric B, and I would clip the 20 for the centers separately. Let me show you what I mean. So in this block, these yellow 4.5 by 4.5 inch squares will be for the corners. Here, here, the center, and here and here. The last thing we'll need to do is cut the 2.5 by 2.5 inch squares that are these blue squares, which we will do a technique called stitch and flip on them. Let's go ahead and cut. Here I have my yardage laid out for cutting my 2.5 by 2.5 inch squares. You can use fat quarters or yardage. When you do, be sure you trim your selvages off and you cut a straight edge along the length of the fabric piece. Then you're going to make sure you're orienting your fabric so that the width, the 18 inches this way, and the 21 inch or the width of fabric goes vertically. We're going to cut 2.5 inch strips across the entire section of fabric and then repeat with the other pieces of fabric. You will need a total of 1.5 yards of blue fabric to cut into 2.5 inch strips. Then we'll subcut them into 2.5 inch squares. If you notice that your fabric has begun to bow in the middle from cutting strips like mine has, just move your fabric over slightly, cut a new straight edge, and then continue cutting your strips. To facilitate the cutting of my 2.5 inch squares, I've taken my strips, 2.5 inch strips, lined them up on the edge. I'm going to cut a straight edge along one side and then begin subcutting into 2.5 inch strips. That should help the cutting go faster. A handy tool that might help is to use a 2.5 inch ruler. I'm going to turn my strips around now that I have a straight edge, line them up, line up my ruler with the edge of my strips, and then begin subcutting. You'll continue subcutting your 2.5 inch strips until you have 320 2.5 by 2.5 inch blue squares. When they're all cut, that will be fabric E. Here, of course, I don't have 320, but that's okay. Your blue 2.5 by 2.5 inch squares will be fabric E. I suggest that you stack them in stacks of 20, not 16. The reason for that is we will be chain piecing or sewing assembly line style using the stitch and flip method when we sew the corners onto our yellow 4.5 by 4.5 inch squares. When we do that, we can do a whole set of blocks at once. As I mentioned a couple of videos ago, I am participating in the Quilter Stand for Ukraine project being sponsored by Pat Sloan at ilovetoquilt.com. Here is my completed quilt block. For this project, I just used scraps I had in my stash. I intend to back it and quilt it and hang it in the front window of my home to show my support for the people of Ukraine. I will leave a link to Pat's project and to several other quilt projects as well, if you'd like to get even more involved in supporting Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. I hope you'll consider it. Thank you for watching today. Please let me know in the comments below if you're participating in this quilt-along. I'd love to know. And if you share on social media, please use the hashtag UkraineAlwaysQAL, which stands for Ukraine Always Quilt-along. Thank you again for watching. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up, tell a friend, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Go on over to my blog at dconedesigns.com and sign up to be on my email list so that you're notified whenever I put out another video and another blog post. See you next week when I'll have Block 2 of the Ukraine Always Quilt-along.